Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Shahram Akbarzadeh. I'm convener of Middle East Studies Forum at Deakin University. This is a weird room. You're all so far out.
Yeah.
So apologies for the distance, the social distancing here. We are recording this session, I'm sure. It will come on. So, and the recording will be put on MESEF YouTube channel. So if you like to go back and revisit the discussion, or for your friends, feel free to share the link to your network. Before I introduce our esteemed speaker, I'd just like to remind everyone that MESEF is going to hold its conference, its international conference in October, on 7th and 8th of October this year. We had a tradition of running biannual conferences pre-COVID. Of course, COVID messed everything up. And as a result, we've had a conference for a long time. We've had seminars and workshops and events, but not a major conference. So here's a chance for us to get back on the horse and hold our conference, international conference. The information is on the website. And please feel free to visit the site and ideally present your research at the conference. We love to hear about your work. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome my guest, our guest, Dr. Maliheh Rezaei, who is based at Monash University and Deakin University, as you see the two logos here on the PowerPoint. Dr. Rezaei specializes in peace education at the two universities. She's interested in critical approaches to peace education and academic freedom, especially in higher education context. Today, we're going to learn about her research on peace education and why it fails in the Middle East. So, Dr. Maliheh, please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. The topic of my research is why peace education fails, problematizing peace curricula in the Middle East. So I've organized my presentation in three parts. In the first part focuses on conceptualizing peace, defining peace education, problematizing peace education, and eventually introducing critical approaches to peace education. And then we move on to part B, in which we are going to analyze curricula in two Middle Eastern countries, Israel and Lebanon. And eventually in part C, I provide some theoretical and pedagogical implications and new directions for future research. So, in the first part, in order to investigate peace, first of all, we need to ask a critical question. What is peace? Actually, there is no consensus about a universal definition of peace. And because the conception of peace is greatly affected by personal values, history, environment, upbringing, culture, religion, education, and lots of other factors that people are exposed to. But for some group of people, peace is like an inner peace. For example, having a peace of mind. For other group of people, peace makes sense when it is looked at besides war. For example, peace comes only after war. For another group of people, peace equates to social justice, human rights, equality, equity. And for still yet other group of people, peace means like friendship with the environment, with the nature, and they are going to foster like traditional cultural values, disarmament, and these concepts. So it is important to consider that there is no consensus on the one definition of peace. So one of the early conceptualizations of peace was made by John Galtung, that sometimes is also attributed and called the father of peace. And he was adamant in the idea that peace needs to be learned, practiced, and reinforced in the education system. So he proposed two forms of peace, positive and negative peace. Positive peace refers to the attitudes, institutions, and structures which create and sustain peaceful societies. And negative peace just refers to the absence of violence or fear of violence. And what is at the moment we are experiencing in the world, even in some of the modern countries that are not directly involved in a kind of violence or war, is the negative peace. And you can see that most of the big powers are still worried about like future conflicts or worried about the borders, neighbors, and they are spending a lot on like military and army. So Galtung also proposed two types of violence. Direct violence is exercised directly by an actor, which is usually manifested by physical, psychological, and verbal harm and damage. For example, armed conflicts. Indirect or structural violence, which is the focus of my presentation today, is that the perpetrator or the actor may not be easily identifiable. So we are going to look at some instances of indirect violence embedded in the school curriculum in different contexts. Riordan is another famous theoretician of peace education, and he also proposes a dual responsibility for peace education. Education about peace, which means that the role of peace education in enhancing the knowledge and understanding of peace, and education for peace, which means cultivating the skills that contribute to generating and maintaining peace. For example, the skills of conflict resolution, anger management, appreciating multiculturality, all are skills that are that education for peace is trying to foster. So, however, particularly over the past 2 decades, peace education has been criticized immensely. First of all, peace education has a long history. It was established as a discipline after the World War II, and it is rooted in Western Enlightenment, and most of the peace education theoreticians are actually Europeans. And they they aim to foster a universal, a historic conception of peace, humanity, and social justice. However, the critics argue that a push to standardize and essentialize a universal idea of peace may backfire because there are hidden power relations embedded in the complex historical relations and that undermine the local perceptions of peace. For example, Zakaria, one of the critics, maintains that peace is perceived as a politically loaded term and has been perpetuated in that reflects the international agendas. Therefore, peace implies conforming to the vision of those who are in position of power. So universal conceptualizations of peace ignore the local and community-based forms of peace practices. So, as a response to shortcomings of peace education, so over the past 2 decades, critical approaches to peace education became popular. So the critics argue that for meaningful conversation on peace, we need to contextualize approaches, and we need to draw on diverse theoretical, political, and disciplinary positions. For example, we can draw on post-colonial theories, critical theories, feminist theories. Bajaj, who is one of the most famous critics of peace education, argues that challenges the dominant conception of peace as a collective issue by arguing that understanding peace involves adopting new ways of thinking, which makes it equally a personal issue. It's not always a collective issue. So these scholars emphasize the role of human agency. Every individual by themselves can decide how to interpret peace, how to practice it. It's not always collective. So therefore, proponents of critical peace education warn us against the risk of regenerating violence that peace education hopes to eradicate if local realities, contextual nuances, and marginalized voices are not considered. So now, when we are going to apply the concepts and tenets of peace education and critical peace education. Into school curricula, we need to bear in mind that curricula, learning materials, textbooks, teaching approaches and pedagogies, and extracurricular activities are all value-laden. They are never neutral. They can transfer certain political, social, and cultural ideologies and conceptions about war and peace to the students. So curricula, on the one hand, can reinforce society's conflict-supportive collective narrative that contributes to the perpetuation of violence, or on the other hand, they can lay the foundation for nurturing peace-supportive perceptions and attitudes. For example, increasing tolerance and trust between the two parties' opponents. So some practices should be adopted that stress teachers and learners' participation in dialogue-based and problem-based learning. This is a really critical point that I come back to it again after we analyze our two cases. So now, after this brief discussion on an introduction of the main ideas of peace education, we are going to look at curricula in two settings. First of all, Israel. So Israel is one of the almost new states in the Middle East with a population of 9.9 million. And Jewish Israelis make up 73% of the population, and Arabs make up 21.1% of the population, and Christians and other minorities make up 5.1% of the population. So you know that Israel has a century-long history of war and conflict with Arab states. However, it has always claimed that they are seeking some peaceful relationships with Arab states, and they are seeking some peace for the Middle East. However, most of the peace building activities and initiatives that this country has started have not been successful. The reason is that the issue of the Palestinian and Israeli issue is a really complex one. It's not just it doesn't revolve only around territorial interest. And lots of other issues about the history, sacred or holy sites involved, and lots of emotions involved. Therefore, just diplomatic and political conversations are not the only solution to the problems in this country. Now, in the next two slides, I want to walk you through some events that has happened in Israel, and consequently the effects that these conflicts and wars had on the curriculum and content of the curriculum. So we start from the late 1940s until 1970s, which was the height of Israeli and Arab conflict. And during this period, the curriculum in Israel delivered the hegemonic Zionist narrative and its value to unite the nation, because it was at the moment that just the state was being formed and established. To unite the nation and to form a clear collective identity in the face of the external Arab threat. So during this period, the textbook and materials contained only national myths, historical events, negative stereotypical references to Arabs, and total exclusion of Palestinian narratives and refusal to recognize the Palestinian entity. So some changes started to happen after 1967, the Six-Day War, that you know that during this war, Israel managed to defeat the Arabic states of Syria, Egypt, and Jordan, and was managed to occupy a large part of Palestine, which included the Golan Heights, West Bank, Gaza Strip, Peninsula, and part of Jerusalem. So during this period, the Ministry of Education's awareness towards the Arab issue increased. So they started to show some more desirability to include some content on Israeli and Arab conflicts in the curriculum. And this continued, but more dramatic changes actually happened in the mid-1970s, in particular, to be more exact, in 1973, after the Yom Kippur war, which was a war between Israel and Egypt. And in 1975, actually, some interim agreement was made between Egypt and Israel, and the two countries decided to put an end to the use of force against each other. So because some kind of friendship was made, so the Israeli Ministry of Education introduced a new history and civic curricula, which reflected the political, cultural, and societal changes that took place during that period. And they decided to represent the history of Israeli and Arab conflict in a more balanced manner. But it is still important to emphasize that still the educational discourse and practices were firmly fixed on the hegemonic Jewish identity. So we cannot see lots of issues and content on like Palestinians identity and history. So in 1980s, a more significant change in the attitudes of educational system occurred with regard to Jewish and Arab relations. And the curriculum, which was published in 1984, contained some general peace-informed guidelines, for example, about the Jewish and Arab coexistence, multiculturalism, tolerance, respect, equality, and democracy. And this continued to the 1990s, where some additional turning points in the peace processes took place. For example, the Madrid Peace Conference or the Oslo Accord, which was an interim agreement between between Israel and PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. However, in the first decade of 2000, the relationship, the hostile relationship between Israel and Palestine escalated again. And during this period, you can see that the peace agendas started to disappear from this curriculum again. And they were substituted by ethnocentric and negative references to Palestinians. So the policy report of the Israel Ministry of Education Committee in that period still proposes education for shared life between Jews and Arabs in Israel, but the education policy still continues a narrow nationalistic orientation until today. So now we are going to see how these forms of structural forms of violence, exclusion of Palestinians, etc., are actually manifested in the curriculum. Before that, it's good to know that Arab and Jewish school system in Israel have totally separate curricula, but the content of the curricula at the end of the day should be determined by the Israel's Ministry of Education. Another interesting fact is that due to some societal divisions, the chance of Israeli and Palestinian students meeting each other before the age of 18, before university, is very slim. It's like 1%. Now, let's look at some of the structural violence in the curriculum. It is manifested in censoring and screening the Arab curriculum to de-educate the indigenous Palestinian students about their identity, culture, and history. The next one is introducing a new compulsory subject in the school curriculum, which is called Israeli Heritage and Culture. So much emphasis on the Israeli culture. Another example is seizing the history books that were published perhaps during the 1980s and 90s, where the relationship was a little bit better. So seizing history books that included both Israelis and Palestinian narratives of the conflict. Another one is removing the concept of Nakba from the official curriculum of the Arab sector. So Nakba refers to exodus or the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians that took place in 1948 through violent disposition of their lands and forced displacement to the Gaza Strip region. So peace education was never given a central place in a real sense in the educational system of Israel. So to make it a little bit more transparent for you, I provide an example. Here you can see an excerpt from the 6th grade geography textbook, which was used in 27 and 28 school year. As you can see here, the students, the Israeli students, are introduced to a history which only dates back to 100 years ago. There is no narrative or history about what happened before that, or before they moved to this land. The land was called Palestine, and the tone of the narrative is like, for example, Arabs are not in the are out of place, are not in a place that they should not be. And it is a very long text, and I just put a very short excerpt of that. But you can see some references to Arabs, and the tone suggests that they didn't taken care of the Jewish land very well, and you can never see any reference to Palestinians. So students learn only about the land of Israel, and the Palestinian identity and entity has been completely ignored in the curricula. So now, because the main argument that I was going to make in this presentation is that every context is very different, and the conflicts in different countries have a quite different nature, and the people's histories background is different. That's why we cannot apply the universal concepts of peace. And to show this better, I decided to include at least 2 case studies to figure out, to actually see how every context is different. That's why now I'm introducing a second case study, Lebanon. Lebanon is another, let's say, a small country in the Middle East with the capital of Beirut, which is neighboring Syria and Israel. The population of the country is more than 5 million. 4.5 million people are Lebanese citizens, and 1.3 million are refugees from Syria, Iraq, and Palestine. So, a wide range of religions are practiced in this country, but the main ones, the dominant one, because they are a Muslim majority country, are Muslims. So, Sunni Muslims make up 31.9% of the population, and Shiite Muslims make up 31%, and less than 1% are actually people who are practicing other less popular sects of Islam, for example, Alawites, Ismailis. And Christians make up 32.4% of the population, and Druze are a group of Arab or Arab-speaking citizens which are practicing a kind of Abrahamic and monotheistic faith. So now let's talk about Lebanon. Lebanon, like Israel, has a long history of both internal civil wars and external wars. But the main issue in this country is sectarianism. It means a kind of religious, it means the use of religion as a political identity. And so, despite the conflicts in this country are like internal, as I already explained. But in addition to that, the interference of some Western countries and some other actors in the region actually contributed to the complexity of these conflicts. So as a result of that, the education system and generally speaking, the political system is actively practicing some form of institutionalized discrimination. For example, historically, Shiite Muslims have been like marginalized compared to other Muslims, Sunni Muslims. And because of this marginalization, actually this marginalization mobilize them to join some political parties. The most famous one is Hezbollah. Hezbollah was originally established by Lebanese clerics as a response to the occupation of Lebanon in 1982 by Israel. But later it was expanded and some regional actors also supported it. Now, let's move on to the effect of like all these historical incidents and how they are manifested in the curricula. So as I told you, Lebanon had a 15-year of civil war, which severely impeded and hampered the development of public education. As a result, private schools were given momentum. So private schools, you know, it is almost the same everywhere in the world. They charge higher fees, but they provide a higher quality education. So during the period that I talked about right after the conflict, more than 70% of the students actually were attended the public schools, the private schools. But as of today, the recent statistics shows that private schools enroll more than 60% of students in Greater Beirut. So the post-Civil War Lebanese curriculum was proposed in 1997, and it contained the ideas of human rights, peace education, but it was not like informal. It was a part of the formal curriculum. For example, like students had a course with focus on peace education. But it was largely descriptive and theoretical in nature, just introducing students to some peace theories, for example. It was not constructive or interactive. So in 2006 and 2007, there was a war between Hezbollah and Israel, which was really intense, and it displaced more than 1 million of people, which literally means 1/4 of the country's population, and 600,000 like people, which were Shiite Muslims, actually were displaced and had to get shelter into public buildings, including schools. So you can imagine that it's been a very difficult situation for students, teachers, and many students lost their parents in the war. So moving on now, I'm going to provide you with more specific examples of how curriculum changed after this incident. Actually, I'm going to draw on a very important study which was carried out by Zakaria, and we really barely have such very good and strong studies which are based on observation, longitudinal observations. But our focus is on 3 schools. It is good to mention that in Lebanon, the schools are gender segregated, between boys and girls are different, and they are also religion segregated. For example, we have like Shiite schools and then we have Sunnite schools. So how what's the school approach to peace education is like? Actually, it involves peace-informed and human rights-informed academic and extracurricular activities, pedagogical strategies, student skill development, educational support structure. However, most of the teachers actually express their concern about the structural violence in the curriculum. And now I want to give one example of that. For example, in the French class, the students were given a letter writing activity, and they were asked to write a letter to Sebastian Scheiner, who was a photographer who published and took photographs of a series of photos that indicated very young Israeli girls in a heavy artillery site who were writing some messages on the missile shells, similar to those that were launched into Lebanon later on. So the content of the letters actually indicated expressions of retaliation, and it made the teachers so much concerned. So they decided to incorporate some critical thinking elements, and they called for a greater reflection and gave the students the opportunity to rewrite the letters. So after some instruction, actually students were able to process their emotions more deeply and to be in control of their feelings, and some of them like reduce their intention, their expression of retaliations. So teachers can modify so the message is that teachers can modify the instructional content to address the psychological needs of the students and help them change their attitudes towards violence. Now, we are going to look at some other very interesting activities from a critical peace education perspective. So rather than rote learning of principles and theories of like human rights, actually students can examine human rights. For example, education right is a human right, and students engage in comparative analysis of the education rights across different Arab states or across different generations. Or they organize some events to celebrate the UNESCO's call for education for all, encouraging even adults, even their parents, who some of them were not literate enough, and they had some performances with themes like "It's not too late to learn, let's go learn." And so these activities, these critical peace activities, were community driven to be more effective. So this is the context of Lebanon, but because there are lots of Palestinian refugees, they also decided to teach students about the Palestinian issue, including people's dispositions, migration, status, violation of rights in Lebanon. For example, students were introduced to the notion of family beyond blood relations. It means that they can be open and accepting to other people and accept them and like them and show benevolence like a family member, no matter if they are from a different ethnicity. And another example of that is that in the arts class, students will reproduce Picasso's Guernica. Just for your information, Guernica was a Spanish city which was bombarded by Hitler during the Spanish Civil War. And students adopted the same work. It was a collective project, and students together created a collage made up of many A4-size paintings that came together in a stunning image. And the theme of that was peace. So in all these various ways, teachers and students demonstrated resistance to the structural violence and historical contemporary oppression embedded in the curriculum. However, many important challenges and questions remain. One of the main ones is that are these schools, for example, the one that we just investigated and they incorporated lots of peace activities, are these schools faith-based or not? Many people would like to know that. In Lebanon, some concerns remain as to whether Shiite schools, for example, are Hezbollah affiliated or not. Many parents out there, with Sunni faith, said that they never enroll their kids in Shiite schools, for example. Because are these schools indoctrinating or brainwashing their students for armed resistance movements? And also, some international actors express their concerns. For example, the Western governments see the spiritual leaders in these schools as terrorists. And there is also resistance from teachers. Some of teachers themselves have certain political orientations, and sometimes there is a polarization between them. Some of them support Hezbollah, some of them do not. And generally speaking, they cannot be a very good role models of peace. So I would like to emphasize that, however, the role of educators and tutors is critical for teaching the peace concepts and modeling the peace behaviors and providing students with the skills to apply peace. But before they are able to do that, the teachers themselves need to be educated about peace. So one of the main reasons that peace in the Middle East, where peace education implementation of that was not successful, is that peace education is a very long process because you need to change people's mindset, and it may take several generations, really. So it's a long process, but there is no sustainable funding and support. Usually there are some peace education program like after the conflicts, but after some time there is no funding and they stop. And that's why we have more severe like conflicts after that. Yeah. So I want to wrap up the main themes that I come up with by analyzing these two case studies. First of all, again, I try to show that the political realities of each country is different. For example, Lebanon is dealing with the issue of sectarianism, which is not an issue in the context of Israel. But in both of these contexts that we looked into, the political situation is really, really complex. And then we looked at some structural forms of violence embedded in the curricula. For example, in the Israel curricula, you saw that the Palestinian history identity is totally like excluded, has been totally excluded. And also in Lebanon, you see the other forms of violence. For example, writing inappropriate activities, writing a letter which actually incites students' negative emotions. And the most important one, the lack of participatory peace-oriented approaches and activities. It means the two parties which are in the conflict never have the opportunity to have any kind of face-to-face interaction or sit down, have a dialogue, and try to reconstruct the meaning, their understanding of peace, war, what happened to their histories, which is the major issues. They just separately learn about some concepts in their schools. And so now let's move on to the final section, theoretical and pedagogical implications and new directions. So the focus of my presentation today was on the Middle East. However, I'm going to expand the implications to wider context, including Australia. First of all, we should know that we already saw in some instances of unsuccessful implementation of peace education, and it's been particularly unsuccessful in the Middle East. But however, education continues to be one of the most powerful tools for social change because it can reshape norms, values, collective memories, and beliefs of individuals and present the next generation with new worldviews. So I would like to reiterate the UNESCO's preamble that since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. In countries with long histories of war and violence, understanding the local context and contextualizing the teaching and learning processes are essential for the successful enactment of peace in the school curriculum. So we need new approaches to understanding the nature of peace, new perceptions on legitimizing the opposing party, new ways of establishing peaceful relations with the opponent, new ideas for how to resolve conflict peacefully, and recognition of the need to reconcile and to construct a new climate. Now, I'm going to provide a new direction for the context of Australia. As you know that the addition of, for many years, actually not until recently, the indigenous culture and history was totally excluded in the Australian curriculum. It's an almost new addition, and they are still in the process of introducing that. For example, New South Wales Education Standards Authority are drafting a new syllabus for a new unit with a focus on Indigenous Australian experience of European colonization to present a more balanced view of Australian history and implementation, which will be implemented at schools in New South Wales in 2027. However, a very simplistic view that, or universal view that peace education offers says that, okay, look, we are respecting all the ethnicities and groups that they are living in our country. Finally, we included their culture and history. However, critical peace education perspective raises very important questions. For example, it asks, who decides which part of the indigenous culture and history should be presented in the Australian curriculum and how? Is it like a self-standing subject or is it embedded across different like subjects? Next, whose narratives does it involve? Is it retelling of what happened to the indigenous people by white people, or does it reflect the voice of the indigenous people as well? Next, are there any participatory approaches in negotiating meaning and reconstructing the old histories? Is there any interaction between like Australian students and indigenous students? It's a kind of collaboration activity, something, and lots of other consideration. And I think that besides some famous theories which are very popular in Australia, like post-colonial theory, critical peace education provides a very strong and good framework for addressing these issues for those who are interested. Now, the concluding remarks. So I'll expand it. I'll start from Middle East and then I expand it to the global peace. Peace in the Middle East. The Middle East has a long record of conflict and restoring to violence and military means to settle disputes. Therefore, governments, leaders, politicians, educators should be educated on peace and peaceful means of settling disputes and ways of peace culture that can serve people rather than wasting their resources and taking their lives. Peace in Asia. There is barely any evidence of successful and effective implementation of peace education in Asia. So, because in many countries, Asian countries, and in most of the Muslim countries, for example, pedagogy has a hierarchical and often authoritarian nature. And structural violence is embedded in the curriculum. I have provided some resources for some other contexts, Indonesia, Pakistan, etc. as well. So there is a need for a widespread, systematic, and sustainable basis, specifically in post-conflict countries in Asia, and eventually to reach a global peace. In addition to, we should know that why peace education or critical peace education is really important and should be at the center of the curriculum, not just as an add-on. So, because in addition to armed conflicts and their impacts, we are facing unconventional threats to peace. Climate change, mass migration, global pandemics that we just experienced like COVID, resource scarcity, racism, xenophobia, gender-based violence, child abuse, patriarchy, poverty, and rapidly increasing polarization that hamper both internal and external peace. So peace-informed pedagogies and practices should be at the center of the curriculum, again, not just as an add-on. And these are the bibliographies. And thanks everyone for listening to my presentation.
So much,
Thank you.
Dr. Maliheh, that was amazing. Well, we have some time for questions. Any burning topics, any or comments, feedback, please?
So we don't have a universal
Peace for you.
so that will remain individual. I'm looking at the question. How don't have universal a very problematic.
Sorry.
That was actually a very good quote.
This one?
Since
Preamble?
war begins in the minds of men, maybe we should exclude men from power. Just throwing it out there.
Yeah, then we can go back to 2022. All the action that was asked by the League of Nations, on the topic, and he corresponded with people forward. why war, why and why. That.
So this is a very good question and a philosophical question, and there is no exact answer to that. But I want to emphasize something, because you said that, okay, if you are not going to achieve like universal peace, so what's the point of practicing all this peace education and etc. So the aim of like this peace education program and everything, any concept in the world, not just peace, is not to reach an agreement in the first place. It's just to develop a deeper understanding. For example, people can sit at like the context like in Australia. Right now, I'm sure even in this meeting, for example, I'm a secular, I'm not a religious person at all, but some people may practice Islam, some people may practice Christianity, etc. This is the aim of peace education. We sit together, we construct the meaning, we review the history, we create new narratives, which may result in more peaceful coexistence, but it does not mean that all of us have to believe in something and each
Other comments? But I have a question about, you talked about the institutional aspect of the narrative that undermines peace, undermines peace education, undermines respect for the other. We talked about how, in the case of Israel, for example, how the history of the Palestinians, even their existence, is challenged and undermined, even ignored, right? So you can't respect another community if you are told that they don't exist. So how does that educational framework reflect the larger political context? You did talk about context, right? But how can we achieve peace education in the education sector when the context is systematically working against it? That's a difficult one.
Yes, that's a difficult question. But again, I provided an example of Lebanon.
Yes.
The education system had like practiced some, let's say, a structural violence. For example, the activity, express and show your hatred to the like photographer that published this, etc. But the teachers themselves were concerned and tried to mitigate the effect of these negative. You know, we have a moral responsibility, like as well, when we think that something is wrong, so we are able like to fix it in a way. But the society, that's why we call it that peace efforts should be community-based as well. For example, in some of these contexts, like in Lebanon, and some of the even like parents of the students are supporting Hezbollah and they affect their children, etc. So it at the same time we say that it is like personal, but it needs some kind of community effort as well. And still, if all people put their effort, they can mitigate the negative effects of that. But there can be, for example, if we want to fix the curriculum, the activities need to be like changed. We need to incorporate some activities that require students to have some sort of interaction, like with the opposing party in a way. For example, there can be some joint exertions. They can go on joint exertions, or for example, like some of the activities that practice in more democratic countries, they can be some exchange programs and such sort of things. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but it is really changing in the world. If you compare how people thought about war and peace in the past and now how they look at it in the present. For example, in the context of Australia, I asked one day we are talking about with my colleagues, Australian colleagues, about the attachment to their countries. I said that Iranians are so much attached to their country because of the very long and past history, and we have always been settled in that particular like geographical location. We cannot imagine that we lose that country. But for some other, my other colleagues, for example, Australians have migrated, they have a history of migration. They look at things differently. For example, one of my colleagues said that if there is a war one day in Australia, I don't like to like go to war and get killed, etc. But this is very different from the perspective of an Iranian. Even if we live our entire life in another country, we say that, okay, in our will, we advise that we want to be returned back to our own land. So these perceptions is very different.
So
And
that's
this
opening up a whole new dimension to this discussion. I don't know if you want to explore that dimension in this session. Okay.
But the world is becoming globalized. The point is that, and the societies, no matter how the education system incorporates some structural violence, people, students have more awareness and they may behave differently.
Okay. If there are no other questions or queries, I'd like to thank our speaker,
Thank you very much.
Dr. Maliheh, for sharing her wisdom. Obviously, peace in the Middle East is like a dream that is very much out of reach. But hopefully, with all these incremental changes, peace education, and other initiatives, you might eventually get there. Lunch is being served. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.